Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's edition of the Watch Club. We're the monthly filmmaker interview series of the Newburyport Documentary Film Festival. I'm Program Director James Sullivan. We're brought to you, as always, by the continuously operating public lecture series in the country. We thank them as always, and we thank you for watching and for your donations. Don't forget to subscribe and like our YouTube channel interview series. Hi, Steve. We're here today with Rick Goldsmith, the filmmaker of Stripped for Parts, American Journalism on the Brink. It's a great film about the state of journalism, the only profession that is distinctly named in the Constitution. Many of you who've watched the Watch Club in the past or seen me talk at the film festival know that I'm myself a journalist and I teach journalism in college to college students. So this is a subject near and dear to my heart. We're going to introduce Rick in just a minute, but first let's take a quick look at the trailer for Stripped for Parts.
Tomorrow will be the final edition of the Rocky Mountain News.
The last decade and a half, we've seen 1,800 newspapers disappear.
The Denver Post isn't dying. The Denver Post is being murdered.
The media is a food chain which would fall apart without local newspapers.
We've been hearing for the last decade or so that newspapers are dying, they're dinosaurs. Because of the internet, there's this bigger problem. There's an industry that's out to destroy newspapers and doing it deliberately.
Distressed investing is called vulture investing for a reason. They're feeding on a carcass of a company. They want to get in, make some money, and get out.
What hedge funds will tell you is this is creative destruction in capitalism.
We got bought by this mysterious company. Nobody even knew who they were. It was called Alden Global Capital, and it was a New York hedge fund. I said, "You're an investigative reporter. Why don't you dig into Alden and just write about who they are and what they're doing, because people don't know."
I work for the bad guys. When did that happen? When did I start working with the bad guys?
The Denver Post has launched a revolt against its owner, New York-based hedge fund Alden Global Capital.
A guy named Chuck Plunkett just decided he'd had enough.
It's either stand up and speak up now or write your own obituary in 2 or 3 years.
It's one of the most courageous things I've ever witnessed in a 40-year career in journalism.
We know from copious research that when a community loses a newspaper, voter participation goes down, corruption goes up.
There is misinformation out there. Communities are misinformed and uninformed, and that's really dangerous.
Somebody's got to cover the story.
To argue for the sanctity of facts and truth.
There are times in your life when you are thrust into a situation where are you going to stand up and risk everything, or are you going to back down?
Newspapers are not just any other business. They are the only private industry specifically named in the Bill of Rights.
History will not judge us kindly if one day we wake up to realize we failed to protect our community's right to know, and in turn, our very democracy.
Please welcome to the Watch Club, Rick Goldsmith. Hi, Rick. How are you?
I'm great. How you doing?
I'm good. We were dealing with some technical difficulties, folks. Hopefully that's over with at this point, but thanks for talking to us. You have made several films, but this is now the third one that you've made on the subject of journalism. Your first journalism film, I think, was about the muckraking journalist George Seldes.
That's correct.
And then you made a film about Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers during the Watergate era, and both of those films were nominated for Academy Awards. So congratulations on that. But do you want to begin by telling us why the distinct interest on your part in journalism as a subject for documentary film?
Well, I've been reading newspapers since I was 7 years old. Usually, I went out to the sidewalk to get the New York Herald Tribune off my stoop and look at the sports scores. But as I grew up, that's when I was 7. So maybe when I was 10 or 12 in middle school, I felt like, newspapers really connected me with the outside world. And I just had an intense interest in what journalists did and was drawn to it. And when I heard George Seldes on the radio, now I'm jumping ahead 30 years to
Hmm.
or so, in 1987, he was saying something about journalism that was fresher than anything I'd heard from journalists half his age. He was 98 years old at the time.
Yeah.
He had seen the ravages of World War One, and he reported from Germany and Italy and Russia, and then became a muckraker.
Hmm.
And the more and more I met in the course of my filmmaking journalists,
Hmm.
the more and more I felt like these people are fascinating people. They tell stories in such a great way. For a documentary filmmaker, you have somebody that you're interviewing, and they talk to you with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and they cover a lot of ground, and
Yeah.
they look at things from all sides, and they're important. They're important in showing us, in deciphering what's going on with the crazy world around us and putting it into context. So, what better subject? I just got drawn to it again and again.
And if we haven't learned that lesson in the last 10 years, the importance of journalism, we never will, right? I mean, so tell us, I think you tell it, I know you tell it in the film, Rick, but for those who maybe haven't had a chance to watch the film yet, we have, when folks watch the Watch Club interviews with us, um, we ask them to watch the film first and then come hear the interview. But, some people have good intentions and then don't get around to watching the film. So for those who maybe haven't seen it yet, tell us about what you first heard about these hedge funds, gobbling up local newspapers around the country, and why you felt it was your next documentary film. This was maybe probably 10 years ago or so, I think, that you
Not
started hearing those stories, right?
not quite. It was in 2018. I was actually corresponding and working with Bill Moyers, the
Oh,
great
yeah.
broadcast journalist who just died earlier this year. Um, and we were going to, I wanted to do a film on him, but he didn't want to be the subject of a film. We thought he knew my work, which was very flattering to me. And of course, I knew his. And so we mutually said, hey, maybe there's a project we could work on together. And we threw a few things back and forth, and nothing quite hit. And I thought that was the end of it.
Mm.
And maybe a few weeks later, and this is again in spring of 2018, I get an email from Bill just when I thought the relationship was over. And he says, I'm sitting here in a barber's chair, and I'm reading this article, and he sent me a link to this article. And I said, this is a film that must be made, and Goldsmith's the one who could make it.
Wow.
And so he and what that article was, which you see at the beginning of the film, actually,
Yeah.
the headline was something like, all the global capital is making so much money destroying local journalism, it might not stop anytime soon. And there was the story of what was known later on as the Denver Rebellion. These journalists in Denver at the Denver Post,
Hmm.
one of whom wrote an editorial blasting the owner of his paper. That's nuts. Who would do that? And the more I read about it, the more I said, yes, indeed, Bill Moyers, this is a film that I want to do. And that's how I began.
So I was talking to my journalism students at Emerson College here in Boston last night and explaining about this film and saying, listen, it's going to sound like a horror show, for those of you especially who are studying journalism at the college level, but ultimately the film really becomes, I think, a positive look at the responses to the hedge fund takeovers. The whole second half of the film is really focused on all these investigative journalists who are trying to figure out just what these hedge funds are up to and developing new and innovative ways to create a response to the idea of the quote unquote news desert, where, the more, the local communities that are increasingly losing their main source of local news coverage. But there's so many examples mentioned in your film, and so many more that you couldn't mention all of them, of those sort of, in many cases, nonprofits now that are filling the gaps where the major legacy institutions have been falling down over the last decade or so. So, did you ultimately see? I mean, of course, on the surface, it sounds horrible. American journalism on the brink. I mean, that's in the title of the film. But ultimately, I feel like it's a positive story about what the future could hold for journalism, if enough innovative people take the initiative. So, do you feel that way as well when you completed the film? Did you feel like, what, I'm telling a hopeful story, even though it starts with a horrible, scenario?
Well, that's an interesting question because judging by my audience, I get both reactions. I get the reaction, oh, I saw your film. God, wow, that was really an intense film and so depressing.
Yes.
That's on the one hand. And the other is just what you've articulated,
Yeah.
which is, oh, I saw your film, but yeah, it was actually really inspiring,
Yeah.
to see that. So I felt like it was really important to not minimize the crisis that we're in, because I think the crisis is born initially by the business model, which has gone
Sure.
away. People don't understand that the business model for newspapers really supported newspapers for 150, 170
Sure.
years. And that is, it was based on advertising. So that the newspapers were not really marketing their product to the public. They were marketing their product to the advertisers, and the advertisers spent so much money that publishers and editors could fill their newsroom with reporters and editors and cover the entire city, if it was a big city or rural town, as well as do as sports coverage, high school sports coverage, and arts coverage, and Dear Abby, and whatever, but at a cost. And
Yeah.
the cost was they were kind of beholden to the advertisers and to the model. And when the business model started to fail, which was roughly at the beginning of this century, around 2000, and all sorts of things that had to do with the internet and Craigslist and the classifieds going away, many, many things. When that business model failed, everybody was in a pickle because the newsrooms started to shrink and shrink. And then the traditional publishers, who had pretty much two goals, which was one, I'm in it for the money, and
Sure.
two, I'm in it for the community, to
Right.
tell the story of this community, to be that central place where the community can kind of get together. They had two goals. They started losing interest in investing in newspapers because they couldn't satisfy the first goal. They couldn't make money at it. And
Right.
who came in? The hedge funds.
Right.
And the hedge fund owners, they had one goal, and that was to make money.
Right.
And they didn't care about the journalism. And hence, that's the story of our film, at least the first part of the story. And the second part is, where do we go from here? And you're right. It's the journalists who are in the film that come up with different solutions, none of them perfect, but each one of them having possibilities.
Of course, right. I'm going to take a quick moment to say, as usual, that if those who are watching the taping live, if you want to pose a question to Rick yourself, please just type it into the chat, and producer Steve will relay it to me or let me know that there's a question waiting for Rick, and I will paraphrase it for him. Rick, can you tell me? So okay. So a couple of things. I'm from the Boston area, but I think you're in the Bay Area. Am I right?
Correct.
You're in Oakland, right? Or the
Yes.
East
Yes.
Bay? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm from Boston, but I spent, my family and I spent 10 years or so in San Francisco, and I wrote for the Chronicle there. So as you probably are aware, the time that I was there was sort of mid 90s through the 2004. And we experienced at the Chronicle exactly what you're just talking about, like sort of the collapse of the paper because of the collapse of advertising revenue. We experienced that kind of at warp speed before most other newspapers around the country experienced that, because in the late 90s, San Francisco was, the early adopter of the internet. So the same people who subscribed to the Chronicle were the first people to realize, hey, I can place an ad for my old car on Craigslist instead of buying an ad in the newspaper like you would do old school. Or I can read the newspaper online. So what do I need this paper version getting thrown on my front doorstep? I don't need to subscribe anymore. Like I'll just read it online, right? So in the short time in the decade or so that I was in San Francisco, that's exactly what happened in the Chronicle, and we were one of the first in the country. We were the guinea pigs in the country to experience that, and then one by one, the other papers around the country started experiencing the same problems, where the advertising revenue going away and the subscriptions plummeting. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Like, did you talk to anybody about those earliest days, which was right around the turn of the century, when those things started to happen, especially in the Bay Area?
Well, it's interesting that you say that because we did come across some footage that was taken from Channel 7 here, I think, in San Francisco. And, the lead was something like, what if you didn't go outside to get your newspaper off the doorstep, but you actually got it on your computer?
Right.
And there was an old version of one of the
ancient looking computer that looked like a washing
and
machine,
had
right?
the kind of like the pioneer newspaper setup that was going to be, that was basically the future. It's interesting because the Chronicle is based in San Francisco, but of course everybody in the suburbs got the newspaper. And then there were 8 other newspapers around, like the Oakland Tribune was one, and the Hayward Argus, or maybe it was the Fremont
Contra Costa
Argus or something
Times.
like that. All those other papers, except for the Chronicle, were all owned as of 2010 by Alden Global Capital,
Yep.
which is the hedge fund that is focused on in our film.
Right.
So they were kind of cutting into the maybe otherwise monopoly of the San Francisco Chronicle. And then in 2016, as you see briefly in the film, those 8 newspapers that were all in this ring around San Francisco were consolidated into 2.
Right.
The Contra Costa Times and the East Bay Times. The Oakland Tribune was no more.
Right.
So in each probably locale in the country, something different is happening. Sometimes the newspapers are owned by a chain. The Chronicle is now a Hearst newspaper, which is relatively new. It used to be their competing newspaper. The Examiner was the Hearst newspaper. Now it's the Chronicle. And hedge funds own newspapers in other places. So we are in a period of intense transformation of who owns the newspapers. And that further complicates the situation. And even further complicating it, since I finished the film, because I finished the film in 2023, just about 2 years ago, fall of 2023, we have, a new administration.
Yeah.
And the administration thinks of journalists as being the enemy of the people.
Right.
So journalism is under assault, whether it be by a business model failing, or by hedge funds taking over newspapers, or by the federal government itself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really incumbent upon all of us, and I do see it because I've traveled all around the country with the film, that there are, hundreds of people in each community who are very interested in what's happening to to the news ecosystem in
Mhm.
their neighborhood, in their city, in their town, in their outpost, that they
Mhm.
want to find a solution for the
Right.
next generation. And
Right.
that's the moment we are in.
We have a question from a viewer, Steve. Oh, okay, this is Sharon. Sharon asks, locally, our public radio station has lost its government funding. Do you agree with some of the journalists in the film that public funding is potentially the way to go?
That's well, I smile at that because, of course, I made that film before public television, public broadcasting was defunded.
Right.
I think that um, uh, public funding of journalism had never been part of the conversation in a meaningful way up until the last few years.
Mhm.
And in the last few years, it has become part of the discussion. And I think it still needs to be part of the discussion. But what we have in this political moment is that's a hard discussion to have
Mhm.
when the best model for public funding of, of journalism has just fallen by the wayside, or not fallen by the wayside, but the funding, the public funding for it, public television and public radio, has severely been decreased. So that's a tough question that your viewer asked. Do I still feel that?
Right.
We have to see about what happens in the next year, 2 years, 4
Mhm.
years, and
Mhm.
see if public funding of journalism is in fact part of the discussion.
Is there, so we've heard a lot over the last several years, and we've sort of mentioned it here, a lot of examples of communities, Baltimore being one, the Texas Tribune. I don't know if you cover them really in the film too much, but you know, they're another one that sort of sprang up to close the gaps in local news coverage. Is there one organization like one of those that's doing an especially good job that you think that you've come across in the research for this film that you think
I
is a
think
good
there
model
are
for?
many, maybe hundreds of
Mm.
organizations that are doing great work.
Mhm.
You mentioned the Texas Tribune. They focus on the State House
Yeah.
in Texas, and we have in California a similar organization. Um, why am I blanking now? Cal
Not them.
Matters.
Oh, sorry.
And
Yes. Cal Matters. Yeah.
EdSource is another one in California, which focuses on education.
Mhm.
So you see, and they're all started by journalists um, and community members. And what you see is, what can we do here in our community that's going to focus on something that serves our community? I go back to this advertising model. With the advertising model being the business model, you public service journalism was kind of taking a back seat.
Mhm.
And I think in the moment that we're in now, and when I say the moment, I say the last 10 to 20 years,
Right.
trying to figure out the new forms of journalism, public service journalism has kind of risen to the top of the concerns.
Mhm.
And so when you see the Texas Tribune and Cal Matters and EdSource, or something like the Colorado Sun, which was started out of the ashes of the Denver Post,
Right.
which was a still going concern in Denver, but this was a new organization that is democratically run, and its focus is on public service journalism. That's the plus side of what we're seeing. And, I was in Maine with the film, and the Maine Monitor is one of the kind of umbrella organizations that's happening all across the state of Maine that is focusing on the public service journalism there. So it's really happening all over the country.
Right. Let me ask you selfishly, because and I started to mention this earlier, but I actually write for the Boston Globe, and I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who doesn't work for the Globe today, but a media sort of a person who knows media, has worked in the media business for a long time, about how the Globe has been doing over the last decade or so. I think it was maybe 12 or 15 years ago when John Henry, who owns the Red Sox, bought the Globe. And from my perspective, I think I mean, I don't know him, I'm a lowly reporter for the paper, but um, I think that he understands that the owning the newspaper, the daily newspaper in Boston, is not the part of his portfolio that's going to keep him a billionaire. It's all the other things. It's all the sports ventures and all the other stuff that he invests in. But to his credit, I think it seems apparent to me that he's done a really good job of investing in the paper. And there's been a lot of really good innovation in terms of the Globe's outreach online, in terms of the Globe's branching into including the Globe Docs Film Festival, Globe Documentary Film Festival, which has become a pretty big thing here in Boston. So other ways to spread the Globe brand beyond the daily newspaper that gets thrown in a paper form on your front doorstep. But from your perspective, outside of our bubble here in Boston, do you know did you hear of anybody talking about whether or not the Boston Globe was doing okay in terms of innovating while you were reporting your film?
Well, I mean, I know that I know Boston Globe's reputation. I will say that just a sidelight, Boston Globe probably didn't know it at the time, but they gave me the title of the film because they wrote an article about the Boston Herald, which was one of the newspapers owned by Alden Global Capital. And in that article, which must have been from 2016 or something like that, they talked about, I think they used the phrase stripped for parts.
Oh, I'm glad I asked.
So I owe it that to the whoever wrote that in the Boston Globe, which is in my notes, but I can't recall the name right now.
Well, sadly, the Herald.
What I think you bring to bear with your question is, what about these publishers? Billionaire publishers tend to be, and there's one in Minneapolis who also owns a sports team as well as the newspaper, and they're producing terrific journalism.
Yeah.
The problem is that, and we touch on it in the film, we don't touch on it, the whole battle to Alden Global Capital was going after the Tribune Company, which is the owner of the New York Daily News and the Chicago Tribune and the Orlando Sentinel and the Baltimore Sun. I mean, big city newspapers. You had billionaires in that mix. One of them being Patrick Soon-Shiong, who owns the LA Times. Another, Stuart Bainum, who was trying to buy that and ended up starting another newspaper, not newspaper, but news organization, the Baltimore Banner.
Right.
The problem is there's conflict of interest. And just having billionaires getting their hands on the paper, they tend to be looking out for different things and getting an edge maybe for their business concerns. And after I finished the film, we saw the height of that with Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, and Patrick Soon-Shiong, both kind of what I would say going over to the dark side, being so influenced by the political winds that they really lost their objectivity and turned their editorial side of their paper over to something other than the total opposite of something that would serve the public interest.
And the Post is a particularly...
to me, that is maybe the lesson that is to be learned about billionaires owning newspapers and the folly, as I suggest in my film, of counting on billionaires to help us out of this problem.
Right. And then the Post is a particularly interesting case study right now because as you mentioned, Bezos is trying to influence the things that they will and won't write about, especially in the op-ed section. And yet you do still see some good reporting coming out of some of the Post journalists, but they've also had a mass exodus of some of their high-level reporters and columnists. So I could talk for hours with you about this, Rick, but we're going to wrap it up for the purposes of the Watch Club anyway. Thanks for joining us tonight, and really look forward to seeing your fourth film on on the business that I've devoted my life to. Thanks again for being with us. We're just going to take a quick moment to thank our sponsor once again, the Ford Hall Forum.
Can I just make it?
Sure.
Just the film is available on PBS.
Yep.
It's pbs.org. It's available for streaming to anybody for free till the end of the year, and then it's going to be on Passport after that. People know what that is.
PBS Passport, yeah.
So yes.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out.
We me on this show and be able to connect with your group there. As you can tell, I enjoy talking about this subject matter.
So do I. Well, thanks again, and we'll talk to you again hopefully soon. See you next month in the Watch Club.